How's that? Any better? How's better? More better. It's terrible over there. Thanks. My fan club, the Honey Drippers, here in the first row. Thanks very much. So, folks, welcome. Thanks for coming out. I'm going to talk a little bit today about the stolen data impact model, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about this. So, how this came about. I guess first I'll introduce myself. I'm Brent Huston. I'm the security evangelist and CEO of a company called Microsoft Inc. in Columbus, Ohio. As near as we can tell, we seem to be the oldest information security boutique in the Midwest. We date back to like the EDI days. How many folks know what EDI is? Leave your hands up. You can retire shortly. Yeah, it'd be great. So that just makes me old. I'm also the head of this project, although I'm currently sort of seeking to move this project to more folks like you. So that was kind of the dual side here. I want to talk a little bit about what we've learned doing the project and hopefully recruit some of you to help us kind of grow the project in the future. So, as you kind of might guess, I guess before I do that, how many folks are looking for this? According to Mebix, I'm supposed to say correct, horse, battery, staple. I'll say it again so you can write it down or take a screenshot if you need it. You'll need this for the cake later. Correct, horse, battery, staple. Okay, anybody need a picture real quick before I move on? This is for the DerbyCon cake contest later tonight. So, yeah. All right, moving on. So, first thing is relax. If you've seen me talk before this time, I'm not going to spit on anybody. Hopefully, I'm going to stay up here on the stage, not walk around. And I'm absolutely not going to talk about honeypots today. So just relax. We're actually here to give you a free gift, free like beer. And so we don't have anything. There's nothing you can buy, all that kind of stuff. So why are we here? Well, back in February of this year, we were sitting around, we were having a number of discussions with those clients, and we were talking to them about different incidents that we had worked over the last couple of years. And what we found was there were a lot of methodologies to analyze the incident. You could look at how you got broken into, you could look at what the attackers did, you could look at how they did recon. Alex Hutton made like a risk fish that you could wrap this thing in and present it and all that stuff. You had all these risk profiles out there for the threat and the vulnerability piece. But after that, after you figured out what got stolen, there wasn't anything. There was no way to like have a conversation about it. There wasn't really any way to talk to your board or anything like that. And so we kind of wanted to work on that. So we took a bite. We are sort of what you're going to see today is a work in progress. We've taken the first couple of steps. We're hoping that you'll help us with the rest. I want to thank a couple of folks here. John Davis helped with this project. He helped build some of the abstraction layer stuff. Victoria Lowengard down here in the front row, can you stand up for just a second? She is a data analyst. She helped us with doing the modeling and the metrics pieces. And a lady named Tamara Kaufman has been working on scenarios as well. She's largely responsible for putting together many of the scenarios that where we've moved from postulate of the idea to proof. So that's a special thanks to those folks. Hopefully that will soon include you. So I still don't get it. What are we here for? We want to scratch our own itch. How many folks have been through a breach where you've had a break-in, and at the end you sort of had some stuff that you had to relate to, you had to talk about, but you really didn't have a framework for that discussion? Anybody? Okay, a few. How many folks have worked large breaches, like more than 1 million records? Okay. How many folks have worked intellectual property cases where you've lost IP? All right, and I'm guessing almost everybody here has worked cases where you've lost control of some portion of the environment, right? Malware, passwords, that kind of stuff. Okay. So what we kind of did, we wanted to have a talk about it. There were a couple of existing tools. There's some tools from NIST from back in the early 80s where there was a snapshot of what got stolen, and you could sort of talk about the score of it right then. but there was no sort of residual mechanism to look at that over time. And after we launched this project in February, in about March, Verizon and a bunch of those folks came out with their risk measurement mechanism. They've got like a bunch of logic trees that you can sit down and run through. And it's pretty academic, it's pretty high level math. You have to really kind of spend some time doing it, and you end up with some pretty decent output. We wanted sort of quick and dirty, a little faster. We didn't want to have to spend a lot of time creating logic trees or running a bunch of simulations. So we came up with this. This is a hacker's view of how to talk about what got stolen. You can think of it that way. We didn't want to write a thesis. So that's kind of our story, and we'll start with sort of how it gets applied. So this is Mary, and Mary's having a really bad day because of Susan. And so Susan, a few weeks ago, she decided she was going to fish Mary's sales team. So she sent a fish over. How many folks have seen fishes before? Okay, I know this never happens to you, but it only happens in Mary's environment, in this little game we'll play. But they clicked on it, right? So they opened it, and their machines got taken over. Okay, how many folks this never happens? Okay. How many folks have slapped a user for this? Okay, how many folks wanted to slap a user? Okay, good deal. So what happens, of course, Susan leverages the compromise, and maybe she stole some credit card data, and she gave that to her friends out there on the net. They posted it on Facebook or something. Maybe she stole some source code. She sold that to a competitor. Maybe she stole the secret formula, the 13 herbs and spices that their company makes, and maybe she sold that to a foreign nation state. Although that's a Canadian flag, hopefully not to Canada. There are no Canadians here, right? Nobody's Canadian? Good. Then they definitely sold it to Canada. So, of course, like all Monday mornings when you get that call, Mary comes in, she's got a really bad day. They spend a lot of time working on it. They work through the incident response process. Managers show up. I know this is all boring. We're going to get to the fun part here shortly. We all live this part. But the board asks her a question. And the board says, what did we lose? So how do you guys answer that when you're asked that question? How do you determine what you lost? Anybody? Okay.
Number of rows. Number of rows.
Number of rows. Okay. So you analyze that, you look through the logs, and you do some analysis. Okay. What if it's not SQL injection? What if malware got loose in the environment? How do you know what you lost? Anyone? Yes, sir. Speak up.
Downtime that screen not able to do their job is not related to cost of downtime.
So downtime, the cost of downtime, but you don't really, you still haven't accounted for the loss of the data. Like, what does that actually mean if they export data? Yep, go ahead. That's the question, right? So this is probably unknown. It turns out when we looked at this, we were looking sort of after this stuff. But since we've had this discussion and we've talked to all these organizations around the world, it turns out you guys should do some work in this space because most folks don't know. You really have, in many cases, no idea what was exfilled. Maybe you've got some server logs that show that the system was accessed. Most folks don't know what files. They don't know what's in those files. Many times they don't even know what business process that server is related to. Okay. So what happens here is you end up basing this on probable access. So you say, okay, here's what's on the server, you dig in, you do a little data mining, you look at the workstations that were compromised, and you say, okay, we think this might be what it is. And so you sort of end up with a giant ball of stuff that may or may not have been stolen. And so far we haven't seen any organization outside of DoD that actually does that third bullet there, where you do counterintelligence and interacting with the attacker. Maybe you reverse engineer their malware to the point where you see what kind of data they're focused on, all of that kind of stuff, right? That can give you some clues about what may have been exfiltrated, and it may up the actual sort of idea and the accuracy of what's in the giant ball. Now, The sad part is we're not here to tell you how to solve this problem. We're telling you how to, once you kind of have the giant ball, what to do with it. This is sort of an afterpiece. What I want you to do, though, is take note of this, because if you're looking for a research project, how many folks have been in security like around the 3 to 5 year plan right now? InfoSec. Come on, it's okay. Raise your hands, folks. It's good. This counts as exercise. Okay, good deal. Those of you who just did this, if you're looking for a way to move your career forward, this is a problem you can tackle, right? You can come up, do some research, come up here, give some talks, and you'll move your career forward. This is a place where we really need help. So we sort of thought that more folks had this under control until we started running the models, and we realized that we kind of missed this step. So it's an afterpiece. So assuming that you have a giant ball of stuff that may or may not have been stolen, what do you do now? The board says, of all these things, this giant ball of stuff, what does it actually mean to us? Or does it cost us money? What did we lose? That kind of stuff. What's the impact of it over time? So that's where the Sdim comes in. Now, when I made this slide deck and we initially had our discussions, we were talking about the fact that we sadly weren't at dollars yet. We couldn't throw the numbers in, the data in, run the graphs, and come out with a dollar computation. So we released this about a week ago on Twitter, and lo and behold, it wasn't 24 hours until somebody said, well, why don't you just start rating each category of loss in dollars, and you'll get the dollars out. It was one of those like, oh, yeah, we forgot about that possibility kind of thing. So that's a piece of it. The tool here gives you a framework for analysis. It's really simple. We've created 15 questions that you can apply to any objects in that giant stolen data ball set. So we've abstracted it up to 15 questions. How many folks can do 15 questions? Okay, good deal, all good. And it sort of acts like a guideline. And you break up essentially the process into 4 areas: immediate impact, short-term impact, long-term impact. I missed the immediate there. But it gives you essentially a really quick and dirty way to prioritize the information, analyze it, and get some scoring. What we have found is that it's really expandable, it's living, it's open source. You can show your management this, and they get it. It ends up in a graph, so you can actually take it to the boardroom and talk about it, and they get it, right? So it's a picture. How many people love pictures? Your engineers don't love pictures, of course, but board members love pictures. So we struggled a little bit with how to do this, but we decided we would eventually release it under the Creative Commons license. So we did an attribution share alike. It's 3.0. It's important. That means essentially, if you take away all the legalese, we're giving this to you as a gift. You can build upon it. You can subtract from it. You can build a commercial offering around it. You can build software around it if you want. No problem. The only thing is that if you build upon the program, build upon it, it has to be in the same license. So you have to share it back to the community. Okay? So what do you end up with? So you end up with this. This is an example of a scenario that we ran. This is a real world scenario. And out of our 15 questions that we abstracted the process from, there are 3 questions in this data set that apply. So the scenario here is you got broken into, and in that giant data ball of stuff that might or might not have been stolen, you lost passwords to all the systems, including some field-deployed industrial devices. Okay? So that's what happened. At the end of your analysis, that's what you think. The first thing is that Victoria kind of helped and really came up with the idea that the snapshot of impact wasn't true, that in fact you really need it over time, and so that's how we kind of broke it out. And so what you see here is the result of 3 different impact curves. The first one, the blue one, indicates the loss of confidentiality of the data that you sort of got stolen would allow an attacker to take control of some portion of the public-facing infrastructure. So this is the blue line, and you can see that immediately when you lost your passwords, all your public-facing infrastructure was exposed. So you have a risk that's very high at that time in terms of impact. Over time, however, you know that you can work through your production environment and change the passwords for just about everything. Maybe there are some services that you can't change the passwords on, or it's going to take a lot longer than you thought. So over time, you see that risk sort of decrease, but at a significantly slower rate because this is a production environment. The second one says it allows somebody to take control of our private inside infrastructure. And you can see that now has a completely different curved aspect. So it starts really high, but since these are your internal systems, you have more control, you can pretty quickly change it, and you can drive that number probably down to 0. The loss of sort of the regionally, nationally deployed critical infrastructure piece, it has a more linear curve because it takes a lot longer essentially to change those devices in the field and push them out. Okay? So how many folks think that you could take something like this as the output in and explain it to executive management? Okay? So you'd be surprised. This is really good. When you get them at the table, they really seem to understand this process. It does break. I told you there are 15 questions. If you try more than about 5 different lines, it seems to break. Apparently, there's like a portal of entry to boardrooms where if there are more than 5 lines on a graph, they ignore you. So try. What we do there, if all 15 conditions apply, you have to end up making like 3 to 5 graphs instead. You show them in succession. So just be aware of that. Yeah.
How do you define the terms, like short-term, intermediate, long?
Great question. You define them on the front end, and we'll talk about that. But essentially, everything in the framework, from how you score it, you might have in your environment, you might only be using low, medium, and high instead of 0 to 10. They still graph properly. If you do 0 to 100, depends on what your risk tolerance framework is, right? Then you essentially can change each one of those axes. In terms of the time span, it depends on what type of data you're talking about. Different regulatory pieces of data regulate that sort of differently. So you decide up front in the team that's doing the analysis, short term is that 6 days, is it 2 weeks, is intermediate then 90 days. So you sort of negotiate that on the front end, and then once everybody's on the same page, you can create the graphs. So here's another example, and let's see, I'm going to walk down. Is that okay with the camera in front of it? Okay. So in this one's sort of interesting to me for a variety of reasons. The scenario was there were lots of plans for a power plant. So somebody broke in and they stole the power plant development plans, both the IT and the physical sort of blueprints for a power plant. The problem was this plant is currently being built, so they're actually now, the building's built, they're populating it with equipment, it's in process. And they had really deployed the bleeding edge of technology for delivery of power. So this was somebody, a power company who had spent a lot of money on research and development, and then the plans got stolen while they were executing them. Okay? So that piece, they lost a competitive advantage. So the first one here, this blue line says, let's look at the loss of IP. So what was the sort of impacts that we see from losing the intellectual property of the power plant? And they rated that pretty high. It ended up starting at about 6. But over time, this is what's important in this one. Over time, that actually ramps up because the longer that somebody has that information out in the environment, the plans, the easier it is to duplicate, the more that'll be spread, and they lose more and more competitive advantage, which you can see here is this brown line, which sort of starts low, diverges, and ends up really high up there with the loss of the IP, right? So when you talk to the board, though, they need to understand that these aren't single factors, that their risk varies depending on what facet of the impact that they're looking at, right? So it's probably the first time they've ever had that discussion about the fact that there are various facets of the loss. Okay? Be wary of that. The next one is critical infrastructure control. This is the sort of hot pink line that's right here. And you can see it kind of starts out, because they're still building the plant, it's not really online yet, so it's sort of a low-end risk, but it ramps up over time as they bring more and more of the plant online. Okay. This other one will make you a little nervous. It's the human injury piece. It also starts out fairly low. They did feel that it was a little scary because essentially, as the plant was coming online, they had the physical blueprints. They could be looking for physical points of failure, right? If there's maybe a couple of beams that hold the power plant together and somebody figures that out, you detonate a charge, you blow up the power plant beams, the whole thing collapses, maybe people get hurt. But what was more important is over time, that line really ramps up sort of as well, because as they bring the power plant online, they bring it to functional, it gets more and more dangerous to the loss of human life as it comes online and starts to spin up, because that knowledge is out there. And over time, that knowledge becomes more and more valuable to the adversary, right? So this is an interesting sort of piece. Now, the next one, and the one that's fascinating to me, is the yellow line. The yellow line is their reputational impact. Okay? So you see all these other lines you go, start lower and move up here to higher, right? But when you talk to the board and you talk to the executive management, their thought was, we've already taken the hit in the press. We had to announce that we lost the data, right? And so as people forget, they see this as actually a decline in reputational risk. Now, what's interesting is Victoria and I went through this exercise and we put this up here, essentially showing their view. We tried to convince them that in fact, the yellow line was not really a line like that, but actually a bell curve. That essentially the data loss would be published now, right? And you take an initial reputation hit. It would decline, but as these things that got more dangerous happen, if any of those things actually occurred, then the reputation line would go back up. And here's the interesting thing, we failed in that sort of demonstration. They had a view where they wanted to look at each one of these facets in isolation. And they actually had said to us, let's not compound the risks here. We want to keep these in isolation. We have to pass these out to audit. Okay? I think that proved for a little bit. Okay? So I would urge you, there are sort of two thoughts here. First one, feel free to generate this for their sort of presence and certainly their will. But you might want to generate a second one where you actually show the curves the way that the risk team thinks it will be, so that they have both and they can make an educated opinion. In this case, probably the board would have been split. Part of the board would have seen it one way, part of it would have seen it another. So just know that you can sort of play this scenario multiple times. All right, so Brent, show me the questions. And so I've got that for you. Try to make this pretty easy. Bear with me because I have to switch off on my iPad. So you didn't think this was going to be, yeah, it's a freaking spreadsheet at DerbyCon. It's okay, don't freak out. All right, this doesn't make you a manager just by watching it. Okay, if you end up in a tie later, that's on you. Okay, blame me. So we really did try to make this simple. We have there are 15 questions. Each one sort of acts as a guidepost. And as I said, you sort of take it to the side, and you score each one in terms of, in this case, 0 to 10. 10 being the worst, highest impact, 0 being the lowest, no impact at all. And you say, okay, given this sort of initial question of, did we lose data that contained private customer data, including regulated data, such as HIPAA or PCI? Right? So really simple question, what was the impact of that, and you play it out. And you do that for each one of these 15 questions. They're all geared towards different kinds of data, so you can apply them regardless of what vertical you're in. You delete the rows, or the rows that don't apply to you. Okay? So if it doesn't apply to your situation, kill it, and what you'll end up with is a concise set of values that you can use Excel or whatever tool to generate the curves. Right? So fairly easy to do. Most cases, this is usually done by a committee. So a team of a few people make that decision, and they essentially, it usually takes about, if you've got about 3 people, it might take about an hour, hour and a half to do. So you can do it really quickly, and you can, if you have that giant ball of stuff that might have been stolen, you can break this out and run it for each object. So maybe that ball has 12 things that might have been stolen, you'll run it 12 times and end up with these different matrices. All right, so in terms of Lee's question, remember you decide the timelines. Negotiate those on the front. These are some things that we learned over the time of running these. You get to set them. You can think of them as your sort of focus and agenda. You can graph single impacts or multiple. No, as I said, when you get beyond about 5, it really sort of loses its view. You want to break those up into multiples. As we showed these to multiple managers, also it seems to be the brighter the colors, the sort of more that they pay attention for some reason. You can add or subtract questions. Subtraction we already talked about. Get rid of the things that don't apply to you. But if you have specific things in your data set that only apply to your organization for some reason, feel free to add those questions in and score them. You know your data better than anybody else. Okay, a couple of caveats here, things that will break the process. If you try to move this from scoring confidentiality attacks, that is data that's stolen and you lost the confidentiality around it, you move to things like integrity attacks or availability attacks. What you'll find is that the model quickly skews. For some reason, it doesn't scale well. We haven't yet been able to figure out where the problem is in that piece. But integrity attacks will tend to rate significantly higher in the scale, and they'll give you sort of curves that are highly exaggerated. They trend to the high points. Availability will tend to score lower. So you'll see sort of skewed scoring in those pieces. So please use it only for confidentiality. If you want to know why that is, integrity and availability, please come to the site that we'll have, and you can grab these, run them yourself, and hopefully you guys can figure out why it doesn't switch easily. I call this next one my Alex Hutton bullet. This is subjective. That's correct. It's not sort of science. It's not. There's no pocket theory behind it. There's nobody building these magical tables. It really is your decision. You're scoring it. Just keep that in mind. However, that said, it also is defensible and it's repeatable. So you can show somebody the model and you can explain why you made the decisions you did. So it gives you a pretty good way to communicate with auditors, with regulators, with law enforcement. So it does scale pretty well for that. After we showed this the first couple of times we released it, a couple of folks came up to us and they said, you know what, this is fantastic for doing what-if scenarios. I can generate these ahead of time based on this wealth of GRC data I have in my databases, so I don't have to wait for stuff to be stolen. I can play these what-if. And then I can go into the board and I can say, see how this line is really high, close to 10. Realize that for me to drive it down, every score that I'm going to drive it down, I need $10,000. So if you want me to drop this line closer to 5, great. I need 50 grand to make that happen. I can invest $50,000 in controls and make it happen. So it really did turn out for these folks. It turned out to be great. And they liked that approach. So we released the tool set in its initial state on the 22nd of September. It's at stimsite.blogspot.com. It is Creative Commons. You can play with it, take this, run the models. We hope that you will. We've run between 300 and 500 models now, and we're trying to grow out more. We want you to take some of them, run your own models, and report back to the site. The more that we do, the better we're going to get at this. If you look at the Verizon data breach report, they've made a lot of that information available in the Veris format. If one of you guys or a team of you folks could take those and run the historical events and return that statistical analysis that would really, really be helpful to the community. We all could benefit from it. So please, the more people that do that, we need that sort of mutual cooperation of different viewpoints in order to eliminate our mathematical biases from the process, okay? So the more people that use this, the stronger the data will be. That. The other thing is, you have to realize that as the creators, we kind of have poisoned the well, so we really can't really drink from it in large amounts because we will skew the data. We have selection bias and confirmation bias both. So really contribute to the program. That's what I'm here to help and sort of hope that you'll do. As a sort of an aside and added value, those of you who are technical folks trying to build a program, one of the great things about this, you can take those 15 questions and ask yourself, ask your management, your network team, do we know where the data is that this question pertains to? Do we know where, for example, do we have HIPAA data, PCI data, regulated data? If so, where does it live? How's it created? Where does it end up and where does it die in our environment? Right? So you could use that as sort of a mapping exercise to proactively map out the environment. So that said, you can follow me on Twitter if you want to talk about the project. We'll blog about it at stateofsecurity.com as well as we go through. And this really wasn't about honeypots after all, so that's okay too. And as always, I kind of leave you with this: you have to get better at sort of sharing. And so I got through this in 33 minutes. Are there any questions over Sdim? I have one more thing I want to cover. Any questions over the Sdim project? Are you scratching your head or you're just bidding on this? All right, we have 200. We have 250, 250, 250, 250. Go ahead. What's your question?
So, did you look at things from both a qualitative and quantitative approach? I mean, like it's like, okay, yeah, you have a higher risk right now in the short term. But, I find like when you're going into that boardroom to tell them how bad it is, like the questions that I get are going to be in the newspaper tomorrow. They want those hard qualitative and quantitative metrics.
So the question is, this is really subjective. I heard me say that. But is there a qualitative and quantitative analysis? Absolutely. If you look at the stuff that the Verizon folks did, for example, they released a logic tree process that will give you qualitative, quantitative numbers. But you're going to have to answer a lot more than 15 questions. You're going to spend a lot more time doing it. So if you can think of them as sort of the longer scale academic approach to it, that's great if that's the data that you need. Most folks don't need that level of analysis, and so they sort of need a quick and dirty process, and that's what we've built. But there are tools out there to help you with that. If this isn't a good fit for you, that's cool too. My other thing I would say to you is if you want it to be more qualitative than quantitative, build it. Take this as the sort of foundation, and then build upon it and contribute that to the community. So thank you very much. I don't mean to cop out that, but that's kind of our take. We've gone this far, and we're hoping that you'll build upon it, but we're hoping you guys will help us build upon it. Yes, sir.
I was going to ask something similar. When we saw the questions and looked like a simple 1 through 10, as you said, simple, but are there any capabilities or any plans to have some sort of weighting factor you can simply choose to take something and weight it up or down because it was a million records? So pseudo-quantitative, maybe not,
So the question is there going to be another layer of complexity added on top where you can do weighting? There's actually a conversation going on right now among the development team about whether or not to build that into the software, the initial version of the software tool. If that's something that you would feel comfortable kind of helping them with, not necessarily the coding, but the weighting, I think everybody would be happy to do, to hear it. We would love that from the community. The problem is, as I said, we now have selection and confirmation bias in the model. So it's really tough for us to come up with the weighting process and come out with a product that is usable to you that doesn't have that bias. So fresh eyes would be great, and we can probably build that together. I agree it needs to be there as it matures. We just couldn't do it today. Yep.
I was thinking that you're going through it, we might not like the impact.
I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
As I was thinking, as you're going through it, why not a likelihood of impact, but you're looking at it from a forensic view, has it been looked at to try to apply the same model as a risk forecasting, like taking these questions, applying it, and saying, what's the, and adding likelihood, does it play out well, does it work?
Great question. So the question is, how predictive is the model? Yeah, yeah. Victoria, do you want to talk? Okay, you don't want to talk about that. Okay. So we believe that the model will become predictive as the data set that's been processed increases. Today, there's a deep divide amongst the team. Half of us feel that it will turn out to be predictive. I'm on the side that this is purely sort of reactionary data. I'm not sure that we'll actually end up with real predictive information beyond simple trending, right? But from that standpoint, we hope so. But we'll know, I think once we get past about 1,500 runs of different scenarios, we might have a feel for how predictive it might be able to be. We just don't have enough data at this point to be able to say, at least in my opinion. And I'll leave it at that, unless, is there anything you want to add? Okay. Yep. Okay. Yep, go ahead.
Along that same line, it's really a question, just an observation. It seems like would be an excellent tool for the end game of a red team exercise. Rather than waiting for something to actually publicly happen, or sitting and speculating, well, what if somebody were to steal some certificates? Actually having a red team exercise performed and say, okay, what did they take?
Yep.
And what would that cost us? What does that mean to us?
So Bill's question is, or comment is, can we hook this into the red team process and use it to analyze the impact from red teaming? Absolutely, you certainly could. There, in one of the large companies we've shown this process to, they're doing just that, and they're using it as a tabletop exercise. They actually were talking about, they were using it to bake off potential red teams. So they wanted to have 4 or 5 red team exercises done and use this sort of scoring mechanism and threat model to determine what teams were better at certain specific areas of risk. Okay? So that there are people looking to sort of build that analysis in and get additional value from the model. Yeah. Yes, sir.
A lot of companies do quarterly type SOX audits and other business lines. What if you were to hand this out during the quarterly audits to 2 or 3 people from each group, HR, accounting, IT, admins, let them fill it out according to what would happen if they lost access to all their data. And you fill that out over a couple of years, and then if compromise does happen, you have a model to go back and look at standards. Right. This is where or use it for training and say, look, this is the most volatile group right here. They have the most to lose. Let's train them first.
So Lee's question, if I can paraphrase, is that you would like to see this integrated into the quarterly audit process so that you build up ongoing history between each line of business, and then use that as either a training tool to analyze who needs training, but also as sort of a toe the line exercise of how truthful were you when something really bad happens. Is that correct?
Well, and we know immediately where we're at when it happens.
Oh, okay, so use it as a stasis model, right, as a stabilizer in an event.
There's
right?
less emotion involved, and it's more they
Okay. So what do you guys think about that? Would you fill this out and get value from that approach? How many folks would like to see their lines of business do that?
So, just speaking from experience, we've tried that before and had a model. It wasn't quarterly, but it was twice a year that we did that. But the problem we came to was we've seen spikes in it as we're going through like some litigation or something like that. All of a sudden, the legal risks go up, or something along like with PCI compliance. All of a sudden, we see that as a risk. And it's like that's the only
response is that the history of that, you've tried an approach like that, and the history of it has the data's been very spiky.
right,
And it's been difficult to use as a real measure.
right.
So one of the things that's interesting, if you go back and look at some of the Verizon reports, they poll the board before they tell them that there's been an incident, and they ask how good their security program is. And the board rates it consistently. It looks like it's very high at the top, the graph sort of goes way out here and down at the bottom. And then 50 minutes later, after they tell them there's an incident, they ask the same questions, and now it's completely inverted. So I believe that you might find an incident, but my guess is just that what you'll see is sort of over time, as they grow known to it, they'll only highlight the things that are currently on fire, and the rest will hit it.
I mean, and that's an inherent problem with subjective polling.
It is.
It's gut feeling.
Yeah. So that's the comment was that it's a subjective piece, and that's the problem with subjective pieces. They sort of mediocre over time if you do it too often. So, yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I have a couple more questions. The first is, do you think that you can ever actually, after having a data breach, you can ever actually mitigate the long-term impact down to zero?
So the question is, after a data breach, do I personally believe that you could mitigate that down to zero? The answer to that is no. I don't believe, first of all, I don't believe that zero actually exists. So, but the other thing is, you can implement controls that might reduce that or might change the pitch of that curve, right? You might be able to influence the attacker in subtle ways, their belief in the integrity of the data, for example, so that you can sort of lower that curve. But this is the exact argument that we end up in quite often. If you think of the 13 herbs and spices, right, and you lose that 13 herbs and spices, you're sort of stuck with, I either have to make a whole new recipe, right, or I have to somehow change some subtle part of my recipe that devalues the data that was stolen. And that's incredibly complex. It's nearly impossible if you extend that same model to something like, let's say, a drug, right? So you have a specific chemical binder and group that targets a specific kind of cancer. If that information gets lost, you can't just add other corollary chemicals to it to change it, right? It may not have the same effect on cancer now. So reducing it to zero is nearly impossible, if not actually impossible. So that was your first question. What was your second?
The second question is, do you have you considered adding defined metrics for what 0 to 10 means? Because in different organizations and in different people, 0 to 10 means a lot of different things.
Yeah.
So the question is, why didn't we set 0 to 10 and say what that means? So I did. In my past, I built this thing called the DREAD calculator, which took Microsoft's view of DREAD for rating vulnerabilities. And I wrote this calculator, and I enforced their rules, right? And so now I didn't make up the system. I just wrote the software to make the system easy, right? I published that. You know what the number one complaint I get back is, well, why is this a 4? It should be a 6. Or why is this a 3? It should be a 5, right? So what I learned from that was, it's probably easier if I just let all of you negotiate for your specific use case what 0 to 10 means or 0 to 100. You know better than me for your specific use. So I would hope that you would negotiate that up front and sort of come to it. Yeah. Other questions? All right. I have 3 minutes, and so for that, I'm gonna talk about this just for a second. So I'm going to give you my hippie hacker confessions. And that's not my dog, but it could be Lee's. I just want to talk for a minute about the idea I spoke about 2 years ago here at DerbyCon, and I gave a sort of emotional speech if you go back and watch the video. And I talk about the fact that we need more folks like you guys engaged in real world problems. And I look around, we've had this conversation, there's a lot of my friends in here, and a lot of us are sort of graying out. We're getting to the point where we're going to be exiting information security fairly soon. We need young folks to step up and take on some of these problems. And so I sort of wanted to talk about that because the model for me was me putting my money where my mouth was. I wanted to go back and tackle a real world problem and actually try to solve it for you, okay? And so that's what it was. So my advice, I have a couple of things that I would advise young folks about. If your hair isn't gray, this will get gray in a hurry, so I'll warn you about that too. But the first one is, if you think that a lot of the speakers that get up here and you're going to see them over the next couple of days, that we're all confident, we don't suffer from any issues. I'm here to tell you and share with you that I have a lot of anxiety every time I get up on the stage. Many of the speakers do as well. If you're down into the speaker prep where you guys don't have visibility to this, but they're down there and everybody's sweating, right? So keep that in mind. You can do this. If you have control issues, for example, I have control issues. This for me was really an exercise, releasing this in Creative Commons mode so that I could turn it over to you and see what it would become, was really pushing my boundaries. And even though your parents probably told you never to run with scissors, I will tell you that doing that and sort of creating an idea, drafting it, and bringing it to the community, it does a great job of shredding any part of ego that you have left, because we literally spent months talking about how to get this into dollars. We tweeted this, and less than a couple hours later, people were like, why don't you just rate it in dollars and we'll have dollars, right? And it's that thing, so you're like, of course you will, right? So don't be afraid to do this. Running with scissors is actually good for you. Spend your time exploring your fears. Learn to do some of these things and contribute to the community. I've been an information security person for 25 years now, and this community has given back to me over and over and over again. It's helped me build a fantastic life, and it will do the same for you. So just ask yourself, what are the tough problems that you could solve, and come back up here and contribute to the community. That said, thank you very much. I'll be around the hallways to talk with you. Always happy to do so. Thanks very much, guys.